Kniaz Oleg, Alyek in Russian and Oleg in Ukrainian, is one of the most popular figures in Eastern European history. According to legend, he was a pagan prophet who established Kiev as the capital of Rus, the progenitor of modern states like Belarus, Russia and Ukraine. He attacked Constantinople by mounting wheels on his ships and sailing them on land against the city of God, where he spiked his shield above its very gates. He tried to cheat his prophesied death, but was bitten by a snake and succumbed to the poison. Nowadays he is regarded as a foundational figure, commemorated in 19th century artwork, including a ballad by Alexander Pushkin, bestowing him the title of Oleg the Wise. However, the existence of Oleg has been debated upon. Outside the medieval chronicles written almost 200 years after his alleged death, his name only appears in a single source from the period of his thriving. This source in turn collides explosively with the inconsistent chronology of the chronicles, making one wonder if they were even the same person. In this video we will explore this mysterious princely prophet, to try and discover if he actually existed, and maybe learn something fun along the way. To properly discuss the veracity of Oleg's existence, we first have to look at the commonly accepted narrative of his life, as written in the Kievan Primary Chronicle from 1111. According to this anonymously written work, the Rus had been invited to govern over the Finnic and Slavic tribes around the lakes Ladoga and Ilmen in the mid-9th century. Their prince, Rurik, governed from the city of Novgorod at Lake Ilmen, and when he died in 879, the crown was passed on to his son, Igor. Since Igor was yet a child, regency was handed over to Oleg. Oleg's relation to Rurik is ambiguous. The chronicle said that Oleg was of his kin, which could mean that they were directly related, of the same ethnic origin or from the same tribe, or even that they were unrelated but had a close bond. In 882, Oleg amassed an army of Varangians, Shuds, Slavs, Marians, Vespians and Kriviks, and conquered the city of Smolensk. From thence he conquered Lyubich, and next he set his eyes upon Kyiv. The city was currently ruled by two renegades, Askold and Dia, and as Oleg's fleet approached, he ordered his men to hide in their boats. He sent a message to the joint rulers, saying that he was a merchant on his way to Greece, who wished to talk with them. They were kinsmen, after all. When Askold and Dia came down to the boats, Oleg's men leapt out of cover, and Oleg told the rulers, "You are not princes, not even of princely birth, but I am." And he brought forth Igor, saying, "See, this is the son of Rurik." And he slew Askold and Dia, and took their bodies to one of the hills, where he buried them. Having thus conquered Kiev, Oleg made it the seat of his power, declaring, "May Kiev become the mother of Rus cities." He was surrounded by Varangians, Slavs, and other peoples, and they were all called Rus. Oleg then went on to establish new cities, and forced the Slavs, Kriviks, and Marians to pay him tribute. He obliged the city of Novgorod to pay the Varangians a tax of 300 grivnas per year, an amount of silver, in order to preserve the peace with them. Then he conquered the Derevlian Slavs, obliging them to pay him a tribute of 1 sable marten per person. Next he conquered the Severians, but only putting a light tax upon them, and forbade them from paying tribute to the Khazars, whom he declared to be his enemy. So too were the Radimiks paying tribute to the Khazars, and he vassalized them also. He went to war against other tribes, the Uliks and the Tivertsi. By 903, Igor had become an adult. You can probably spot some chronological issues here. And though Rurik had appointed him as ruler, Igor still followed under Oleg. In 907, Oleg gathered a mighty army and sailed to Constantinople. The Greeks fortified themselves behind the Constantine walls and blocked access to the Bosphorus. Oleg and his men made landfall and ravaged the surrounding countryside, demolishing palaces and burning churches. Prisoners were executed or tortured, some shot to death, others drowned. Oleg then ordered his men to mount wheels upon their ships, and then use sail power to roll his fleet towards the city. The Greeks were so terrified by the sight of this that they begged for Oleg's mercy and offered to pay him tribute. They even sent him a banquet of food and wine, but Oleg did not indulge in it, knowing the feast to be poisoned. The Greeks declared, "This is not Oleg, but the holy Demetrios which God has sent upon us." A payment of 12 grivna were rendered unto every man of Oleg's fleet. Then he sent his delegates to negotiate for a preliminary treaty with the emperor. The next year, Oleg would send his delegates again to secure a proper trade agreement. Before departing, Oleg had his shield mounted over the gates of Constantinople to flex his power. Then he ordered the Rus to have sails made out of silk, and for the Slavs to have sails of nettles. When the fleet set sail, the nettle sails were torn to pieces, and the Slavs said, "Let us stick to our rough sailcloth. Nettle cloth is not for the Slavs." The story is undoubtedly allegorical, but I haven't found any interpretations of its meaning. Oleg arrived in Kiev shortly before 9/11, with a great bounty of gold, silk, fruits and wine. People called him a wizard. The chronicle claims that people back then were still heathens and unenlightened. As the next year came, a star shaped like a lance appeared in the west. The legend says that Oleg died 5 years after returning to Kiev. It says that Oleg had previously consulted wizards called Volchev on how he would perish. One of them told him that his favorite horse, who he always mounted, would be the cause of his death. Oleg remembered this and swore that he would never more mount his favorite horse. He kept his horse in a stable, where he ordered his servants to keep it fed, but never to show it to him. 5 years after returning to Kiev, Oleg took the wizard and went to the stable, where he asked the stable master to see the horse. The stable master said, "He has died." Oleg mocked the wizard, telling him that the horse had died, but that he still lived. He asked to see the horse and they brought him to its skeleton. He victoriously set his foot upon the skull and asked laughingly if the skull was supposed to be his death. A snake then crawled out of the skull and bit Oleg in the leg. He succumbed to the poison and perished shortly thereafter. The people mourned his passing, and he was buried in a mound upon the hill Shekovitsa. According to the legend, he had ruled for 33 years. Oleg is seen as a very important figure in Russian and Ukrainian historiography, as his legend provides a coherent origin for the Rus state and foundation of medieval Kyiv. However, most historians recognize it as an artificial narrative devised by the primary chronicle to provide a coherent origin of the Rus state, the foundation of Kyiv, and the dynasty's rule over the entire region. The reality seems to have been much more complicated. Medieval Kyiv wasn't even properly settled until at least 887. I have an entire video about it. And though there might certainly have been disputes over tributaries, the Rus seem to have had close ties to the Khazars at least until the reign of Sviatoslav starting in 945. By the time of the chronicle's writing, the Khazars were a vanquished enemy, and Kyiv the almost sacred capital, a Constantinople on the Dnieper. The power of the ruling family was tenuous, so the purpose of the chronicle was to legitimize their rule over the entirety of Rus, and to secure the legacy of Kyiv as an ancient and even sacred city. For this purpose, Oleg became an important literary device. And as we saw in the story, the legend is speckled with literary devices and exaggeration. His dramatic killing of Askold and Dia, sailing his wheeled ships on land, mounting his shield above the walls of Constantinople, the anecdote of the silk and nettle sails, and of course, his ironic death at the fangs of a snake. The manner in which Oleg perished is a common literary motif in the medieval period. Most have drawn connection to the saga of Örvarodur, written in Iceland at some point in the 12th century. It concerns a Norwegian, a Hålogaländer to be specific, prophesied to die by his own horse. So when Örvar grew up, he killed his horse and buried it. Some years later, when he returned, he went to the grave of his old companion and mocked him, only to trip over his skull, from which a snake appeared and bit him. Örvarodur appears in other sagas as well, and some historians believe him to have existed, and others have gone so far as to draw a direct connection between him and Oleg, or at least to the Rus. Örvar and his people, the Hålogaländers, had trade connections deep into Bjarmaland, what is now Agalensk and the Kola Peninsula, from whence they exported furs. The death of Oleg also bears similarities to the life of Saint Demetrios, a Christian soldier, and if you remember from the tale of Oleg, the Greeks directly compared him to this saint when he attacked Constantinople. Biblical and Christian motifs permeate the entirety of the chronicle, which was written by an Orthodox monk. As mentioned previously, the most glaring issues with the legend of Oleg regard the chronology, especially regarding Rurik's heir and Oleg's successor, Igor. According to the legend, Oleg became regent of Rus upon Rurik's death in 879, since Igor, Rurik's son and rightful heir, was still a child. So Igor was at least born in 879. Oleg then conquers Kiev in 882, where Igor is described as a young prince. But it's not until the year 903 in the chronicle that it declares that Igor became an adult. By this point, he would have been 24. It's not like 24-year-olds are especially smart, but medieval rulers could be considered adults as early as 16. Neither did Oleg hand over the regency, but continued to rule in Igor's stead. In the same year, it is said that Igor married Olga. Here we find another chronological issue. Olga must have been at least 14 or 15 at the time of her marriage to Igor in 903, meaning she would have been born in 888 or 889. However, Olga does not give birth until the 940s, when she would have been at least 50 if we follow the official chronology with some lenience. It's not impossible, but it gives historians a reason to doubt. Of course, we do know for a fact from external documents that both Igor and Olga existed during the early to mid-10th century, but it's their relation to Oleg which raises an eyebrow. It's more likely that Igor was born in the late 9th century or early 10th century, and Olga in the 910s or 920s. Another reason to doubt the chronicle is due to how it differs from other chronicles. The Novgorod Chronicle confirms that Igor was the son of Rurik, but that it was Igor who led the expedition to Kiev, and that Oleg was a mere voivoda, commander. Igor is the one holding a speech to Askald and Dia, but it is slightly different. In the primary chronicle, Oleg told them that they were not princes nor of princely birth, but that he was of princely birth. In the Novgorod Chronicle, Igor only says, "You are not of princely birth, but I am." After conquering Kiev, Igor becomes its sole ruler, not Oleg, indicating that he was an adult at that point. It confirms that Oleg alone led an expedition to Constantinople, but in 922 instead of 907, and that he afterwards went to Ladiga, where he perished from a snakebite in a lake. I think it is entirely possible that Igor and Oleg did conquer Kiev, but much later than when the chronicles said, sometime in the early 900s instead of the 980s. This would also correspond to the archaeological findings, as Kiev did not really become noteworthy until about then. Some have attempted to explain the inconsistencies between the chronicles and their strange chronology. It has been suggested that there might have been two Igors, two Olgas, and even two Olegs. Even that Oleg was not a name, but an honorific, a sacred title given to all of the pagan priest kings of early Rus. And this has been connected to the Norse form of Oleg, Helgi, meaning the holy. Others have suggested that Oleg was an alias for Igor. The latter two theories, the alias theory and the Helgi connection, are based on the single external document mentioning a person that is believed to be Oleg. Known as the Schechter letter or Genesia letter, it is a Jewish Khazarian correspondence to the Genesia of Cairo, written in the 950s or 960s, thus making it more contemporary than the chronicle. Since the contents of the letter do not agree with the chronology of the primary chronicle, the letter was long dismissed as a fabrication. But historians have started to revise it in the last half century or so, owing to the increased questioning of the chronicle's veracity. So, what does the letter actually say? Parts of the letter are sadly missing, but judging by the remnants, it is a correspondence between a Khazarian Jew and a dignitary abroad. The first part of the letter contains an account of how Khazaria was converted to Judaism in the 9th century, but this part doesn't match with other contemporary accounts and appears to be largely symbolic. The second part, which is the one of interest to us, describes a string of hostilities between Rus and Khazaria in the 940s. The instigator of these hostilities was a mysterious HLGW, most often read as Helgu, and believed by most historians to mean Oleg of the primary chronicle. Problem is that even in the Novgorod Chronicle, Oleg had perished much earlier. For a long time, Owing to the chronological disagreement between the chronicle and the letter, many historians chose to ignore it. However, many holes have been poked in the chronicle since then, and the events described in the letter agree with events described by multiple other sources and the timeline presented by them. Thus, the letter seems more reliable than the chronicle, which was written almost 200 years after and based on oral tradition and Byzantine chronicles, which didn't really care much about the early Rus. Let's take a look at the events described in the letter, which are quite intense and not merely exclusive to Oleg. Indeed, it is hard to pinpoint a start date, as they concern a long and slow-burning line of religious disputes between Byzantium and Khazaria in the early 10th century. The Byzantines attempted a mission in Alania, seemingly defeated by the Khazars. In retaliation, the Byzantine emperor decided to forcefully convert the Jews of his empire. The Khazars responded by, quote, bringing many Christians to ruin. Having heard of these reprisals, the emperor sent great presents to Helgu, king of Russia, and incited him to attack the city of Samkarch, also called Tmutarakan, situated on the eastern side of the strait leading into the Sea of Azov. The emperor's choice of mercenaries might seem a bit strange, since I previously talked of the close relation between Khazaria and the Rus. In the early 10th century, this relationship was starting to break down. In 910, the Rus had launched a massive attack on the Muslim coast of the Caspian Sea, but on the way back, were betrayed by the Khazars and massacred by the Khagan's Muslim guard. The Khazars were no doubt pissy about the Rus snatching their tributaries. Relations had never healed, and the Rus had been waiting for revenge. Helgu arrived at Samkarch and took the city entirely by surprise. He snuck up on it at night and found the commander completely absent. After plundering the city, they traveled to Kherson in Byzantine Crimea, where they intended to sell their captives. The Khazars had now gotten wind of this scheme and launched a retaliatory strike on Crimea, laying siege to Kherson. The defenders attempted to dig tunnels and attack the besiegers from underneath, but were defeated nonetheless. The Khazars forced the inhabitants to pay tribute, but the Ruskarian slave traders still present in the city were put to the sword, and the Khazar captives liberated. The Khersonite betrayal of the Rus was seemingly avenged some 30 years later, when King Vladimir occupied the city. Having taken their revenge on Kherson, the Khazars went to war against Helgu and the Rus. After 4 months, Helgu had been defeated, his plunder repaid, and presented an ultimatum. The war would either continue, or Helgu would attack Constantinople, as he had done Samkarch. The attack on Constantinople in 941 is well documented by multiple sources: the Schechter letter, the primary chronicle, the chronicle of George Amartolos, and the testimony by Liutprand of Cremona. So we can be almost certain that it happened, and all of the sources seem to agree on most of the details. The big issue is the leader of the attack. The primary chronicle says it was Igor. Byzantine sources call him Igor, and Liutprand Inger. But the Schechter letter says it was Helgu. There have been many attempts to reconcile this issue, some weirder than others. Some believe that Igor attacked Constantinople and that Oleg attacked other possessions in the Black Sea. Others say that Oleg and Igor was the same person, and I mentioned the idea of Oleg being a sacred title rather than a name. Most likely, Oleg was either a prominent commander or he was a king subordinate to Igor. The rulers of medieval Russia are usually titled Princess in English, a faulty and modern translation of the Slavic Kniaz. The word is believed to have derived from the Gothic or Proto-Germanic konungas, the source of the English word king. In English, king has a more definite meaning, whereas in Scandinavia, for example, the title was used by more minor and independent rulers, often called petty kings in the history books. These petty kings were in turn often subject to another king. In some places they'd be called a high king to distinguish them from the subordinate kings, and in Russia they would eventually use Veliki Kniaz, great king. But in the 10th century the big cheese was simply called a Kniaz or king, and even Khagan. So whilst Igor was most likely the great king, ruling the entirety of Rus from Kiev or Novgorod, Oleg was possibly a petty king, perhaps ruling from Chernihiv or Smolensk. This would also be in line with the idea from the Novgorod Chronicle of Oleg as a commander in Igor's army instead of his king. Whilst we were discussing this rather lengthy tangent, the Rus warriors had been burnt to a crisp. Let's wind back the clock a bit. Igor had mustered a fleet of 1,000 ships. Some sources say 10,000, but that seems a bit dramatic. And he sailed southward to attack the Roman capital. But the Bulgarians caught wind of the impending assault and warned the Byzantines in advance. When the Rus arrived, they found a fleet waiting for them. The fleet looked far from impressive, consisting of 15 old galleys pulled out of mothball. The Rus were undoubtedly eager to engage. However, the galleys had been mounted with flamethrowers in the bows, sterns and broadsides, and when their sides were swarmed by the Rus vessels, they were burned. The sight of this terror alone was an effective weapon, as the Rus abandoned their ships to save themselves, or simply preferred to drown over roasting. Some were not so lucky, as the mystical Greek fire was able to burn on the water itself. Others were pulled to the depths by the weight of their armor and helmets. A number of the attackers managed to escape, and made landfall on the southern coast of the Black Sea. Having lost so many men, they were now unable to attempt the city of Constantine, and opted instead to devastate the countryside, burning churches and villages, mutilating, torturing and murdering. Captives were used as target practice, or crucified. Some had nails driven through their heads. Eventually, the Rus were cornered by a Byzantine army. After a hard battle, the Rus escaped into the night. As they went off to sea, they met once more with the Byzantine navy. It seems to have been a repeat of the initial battle. Those who were taken captive were dragged before the Byzantine commanders and executed in front of foreign ambassadors. Igor and Oleg appear to have split up. Igor went back to Kiev to lick his wounds, and would 3 years later sign a new peace treaty and trade contract with the Byzantines. According to the Schechter letter, Igor was so embarrassed by his defeat that he decided to diverge and attack Persia, where he perished. Whilst the letter is silent on the details of this attack, a thorough account was provided by Muslim sources when he attacked Azerbaijan in 944. It is unknown what he was doing in the 3-year time gap between then and the attack on Constantinople. We never received the name of the Rus leader in any of the Muslim sources, but it was most likely Oleg, judging by the contents of the Schechter letter. In one of the sources, the Rus were accompanied by Bertus, Alans, and Khazars. However, this source wasn't recorded until around 1200, but appears to have been based on local oral tradition, so perhaps there is some truth to it. In order to enter Persia and the Caspian Sea, Oleg would have needed to sail through the Khazarian lands. Perhaps he struck up a new friendship with them, and perhaps he had spent the last 3 years in their service. Oleg's most prominent attack was on the city of Barda. As the Rus made landfall, they were engaged by a Muslim army and defeated them in battle. When they entered the city, the ruler had long since fled in the utmost haste. Interestingly, strangely even, all accounts describe the Rus occupation as peaceful. They encamped outside of the city and quote-unquote policed it for security. This could have meant that they policed other Rus from abusing the populace, or that they kept the populace under lock and key. Ibn Miskawai recounted that the Rus declared the following: "There is no dispute between us on the matter of religion. We only decide the sovereignty. It is our duty to treat you well, and yours to be loyal to us." The intentions of the Rus can only be speculated upon. It isn't unbelievable that Oleg, now disgraced from his failures back home, was looking to create a new home in the Caspian Sea, a second Rus. Some even believe that, unlike Igor, who had made peace with Byzantium, Oleg was still hostile towards them and friendly towards the Khazars, and intended to use Barda as a staging point for a second invasion, perhaps by land into Anatolia. Whatever his plans were, they weren't to be. As the Muslim forces gathered for a counter-offensive, the Rus began quarreling among themselves, many of them less inclined to occupation and more inclined to a more grab-and-go style of approach. The locals took advantage of this and rose up against the occupiers. After quelling the riot, the Rus ordered the people to leave the town, permitting them to take all of their possessions with them, but after 3 days, they would attack anyone who stayed. Most of the inhabitants did, and the massacre began. Some 10,000 people were taken captive and held for ransom inside of a mosque. A Christian came forth and offered 20 dirham for every soul. But the Rus did not keep the end of the bargain and murdered most of their captives. Some managed to escape, The Rus took their possessions, ravished their women, and forced the rest into slavery. A new Muslim army had been mustered by Al-Marzuban ibn Muhammad, consisting of up to 30,000 men. The opposing forces never engaged in a direct confrontation, the battles limited to skirmishes in the mornings and evenings. Marzuban's forces feared the Rus and were defeated each time. It wasn't the steel of the country which would prove the Rus' downfall, but its fruits. Having gorged themselves on the bounties of the country, the Rus soon discovered it to have been tainted. Too late. Many fell sick and died from dysentery, a horrible disease which causes you to defecate bloody diarrhea. This event was also recounted in Byzantine sources. Al-Marzuban devised a new stratagem to deal with the Rus. He engaged them with his forces, only to retreat after a brief melee. Eager for combat, the Rus pursued, only to be lured into an ambush. However, the Rus discovered the ambush and forced most of the tricksters to flee. Al-Marzuban prepared himself for martyrdom, but as he made his final stand, the retreating forces returned, and those still hidden in their positions sprang forth and charged the Rus from their rear. They were soon forced to retreat, and the Amir, prince or leader of the Rus, presumably Oleg, fell in the battle. Allegedly, he had been the only Rus riding into combat, allegedly on a mule. Perhaps his demise on horseback was the source of his legendary end as told in the primary chronicle. The survivors retreated to the citadel of Sharistan, where they kept their plunder and prisoners. Al-Marzuban laid siege. However, he was soon personally forced to depart owing to conflict elsewhere. His followers kept up the siege and eventually took the castle, though the Rus had gone to their boats and escaped. The besiegers were too tired to pursue. They excavated the graves which the Rus had dug for their comrades, uncovering the remnants of weaponry, servants and women, all buried together with the warriors. The Rus had been expelled, and Oleg was dead. Provided it was Oleg, we can never know for certain, or if he even existed. But judging by the different sources, it seems most likely that he was a petty king and ruler of one of the Rus territories, and a close confidant to the Khagan. It is difficult to ascertain when he was born and how old he was at his presumed time of death. Most historians seem to believe that he was the one who attacked Constantinople in 907, so he must have been at least 20 by then, or even in his 30s. Then he must have been born when Rurik allegedly died, and quite an old fellow when he attacked Persia in the 940s. But the evidence we have of Oleg participating in the attack of 907 are the trade treaties recounted in the primary chronicle. And while the trade treaties are unanimously agreed to be correct and cited from Byzantine sources, some believe the name of Oleg was added to them by the chronicle, which wouldn't be the last time that it made anachronistic additions. So there's not even any clear evidence of Oleg being an adult in 907. The most reasonable conclusion is that an entire generation of rulers between Rurik and Oleg appear to be forgotten. There's also the matter of Oleg's ethnicity. To be honest, it's not really something I am very interested in discussing, since there's so little evidence one way or the other, nor is it especially important to his story or the history of the Rus. But I know there's gonna be comments and questions about it in the comment section, even though most of those comments probably won't be watching the video this far. The dispute regards whether Oleg was a Norseman or a Slav. The evidence of his Norse origin comes from the name itself, Oleg, believed to stem from the Norse name Helgi. Indeed, in the Schechter letter he is specifically called by this name, Helgu. He also operated in a very Viking-esque manner, plundering and attacking cities from the water. But, as described in the primary chronicle, the Rus were diverse, consisting invariably of Varangians, Slavs, Finno-Ugrians and, most likely, Balts. The Vikings were often as diverse, drawing Baltic Slavs and Finns into their ranks, and intermarrying with all of these peoples. Viking was an occupation, not an ethnicity. It also seems likely that, owing to the prominence of Norsemen, it became popular to adapt their names, so a name in and of itself might not necessarily be indicative of someone's origins, and shouldn't be used as conclusive evidence. Indeed, there is some evidence pointing to his Slavic origin. In the treaties between Rus and Byzantium, it is written how the Rus delegates swore to uphold the treaty on their gods. Perun, and Volos. These are Slavic gods, not Germanic. The argument has been made that Oleg and the Rus were Norsemen, who were quickly being absorbed into the Slavic culture and religion. It is also possible that the treaty as written in the Chronicle changed the names of the Norse gods, very similar to the Slavic ones, into something more familiar, rather than old, foreign gods long since forgotten. So in the end, Oleg's origins cannot be argued for certain, except that he was a Rus. The truth remains ever elusive. This video has been dedicated to learning about Oleg, who was closely connected to Igor. Much remains to be said about Igor, but he'll be covered in a separate video largely related to this one. So, stay tuned. If you enjoyed this episode and the content I produce, please consider becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter, or even making a one-time donation via PayPal or the YouTube donation system. You'll find all of the necessary links in the description below.